Hello, I'm Louisa Pilbeam. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, China makes the cheapest electric vehicles in the world. Europe needs them to meet ambitious climate targets, but imports could send European car manufacturers into a tailspin. Will either side compromise? Also this week, President Trump is fighting hard to get lower interest rates in the US, but will that send domestic inflation up? And what's the global impact? Figures suggest only 5 million people from a population of 240 million pay tax in Pakistan. Can the government change the system to keep the IMF happy and stay in power amid the threat of protests? A summit between China and the EU has been cut to one day as a hoped-for surge in trade deals has failed to materialise. One sector which is raising tensions between the two is electric vehicles. China makes the cheapest in the world, and if Europe is to meet its ambitious climate change goals, those cheaper electric vehicles could change the game. But the EU has to protect its own vehicle manufacturing industry and the 14 million workers employed in it. Chinese EVs have significant advantages in the push for a larger share of the European electric vehicle market. They're often cheaper. China's BYD Seagull sells for about $10,000, has a recharge range of up to 322 kilometres and a top speed of 150 kilometres an hour. Compare that with Renault's Twingo Electric, one of the cheapest European cars. It's a similar size, but costs around $20,000, has a range of up to 190 kilometres and a top speed of 135 kilometres an hour. European imports of Chinese EVs surged from $1.6 billion in 2020 to $11.5 billion in 2023. Though Chinese cars are still a small share of the total European car market, Chinese brands grew from 1% of the EV market in 2019 to about 15% in the first half of last year. Victoria Gatenby reports.
They're said to be fast, efficient and crucially cheap. Chinese electric vehicles are entering the global market in large numbers, sometimes costing thousands of dollars less than their European or American rivals. Analysts say that's down to a combination of factors, starting with state support. They say China has spent years subsidizing EV manufacturers, creating an industry capable of building at scale.
Government policy definitely plays a big part. China is the only country in the world that has all the industrial categories by United Nations. So everything from raw material procurement to after sales, you can just have everything in China.
The European Union calls it an unfair advantage, an accusation China rejects. Critics point out that Europe also supports its own industry through research funding, purchase subsidies and tax relief. Chinese firms also dominate the global supply of EV batteries, accounting for more than 75% of the world's production capacity. That means lower input costs and tighter control over the supply chain. Labour is also cheaper in China, and in some industrialised zones, authorities cover infrastructure and logistics costs, further lowering overheads. But China may be producing more EVs than it can sell domestically, leading to what some call overcapacity. The result is a global push to export surplus cars, and fast.
China has serious domestic problems, and therefore they shifted investment that used to go in the real estate sector, that is currently suffering, into certain industries and created an overproduction. So the dumping accuse that China sells products cheaper than the production to the European market, and that is an unfair operation that would seriously harm the European Union, is a fair point.
The European Commission imposed tariffs of up to 35% on Chinese-made EVs last October, on top of the 10% import duties that were already in place. It's also taking steps to diversify its supply chains and secure long-term access to critical raw materials used in EVs. European manufacturers may still have legacy and engineering excellence on their side, but China's speed, scale and cost are forcing a rethink of what it takes to stay competitive. Victoria Gatenby, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
Stephen Okin is the CEO and founder of APAC Advisors, a sustainability and public affairs consultancy. He is also a former Deputy General Counsel in the US Department of Transportation. He joins us from Singapore. Now, it's really great to have you on the programme, Stephen. So, does Europe face a dilemma here? If it keeps buying Chinese EVs, it would help them to reach their climate targets of cutting emissions by 2030, but it would also harm its industry. So are these conflicting goals?
Well, this isn't an EU issue. This is the EU. This is Canada. This is the United States. This is Brazil. This is anybody with a significant auto sector. The Chinese have spent $250 billion, at least, in terms of building up their EV capacity, building up in what is inarguably a great industry. The problem is it's an unfair industry. And so you can't ask yourself, should we trade off manufacturing jobs for climate? It's more than that. It's trading off your national security. You have to look at this independent of the climate crisis. And the EU, as have almost every other country with a strong auto sector, has said, we can't allow China to frankly cheat when it comes to competition in the auto sector. And so that's why the EU is holding tight on tariffs. That's why everybody else is holding tight on on tariffs against Chinese EVs.
OK, so you mentioned there that Europe pretty much think that China is cheating. The European Commission released a report last July where they said that grants, tax incentives, preferential loans with China, doing all of that in their country. Is China, though, actually breaking any rules?
These are unfair subsidies. Of course, from an international trade perspective, they are. Look, if China wants to spend, and any country, it's not a Chinese issue, if any country wants to spend money on their domestic sector to grow their domestic manufacturing base, to sell to their domestic customers, of course you can do that. It's when you start to take all of that excess capacity that you have created through state subsidies and then use it to unfairly compete, that's where the line gets crossed.
If then these subsidies are unfair, then is it ultimately the consumer who's literally going to pay the price?
I mean, again, you have to look at it much more broadly than that. Do you want to have cheaper electric vehicles? If your answer is stops and starts there, by all means, let these subsidized vehicles come in. But what is that going to cost you in terms of your own jobs? What is that going to cost you in terms of your national security? When you need an auto sector for your military, you need, you need tanks, armored personnel carriers, the parts and supplies that go into that. Are you willing to give all of that up for subsidized and cheap? And when I say cheap, I mean by price, because there's no question the Chinese are now producing world-class quality when it comes to the EVs. But that's the question, is you have to ask yourself, how do you look at this in the totality? And everybody, the Europeans, the Americans, Canadians, are all coming to the same place. We can't make this trade-off.
In terms of Europe, though, and other countries that you have mentioned, is there a little bit of hypocrisy there? So to look at this from China's point of view, just for a moment, Europe, for example, has an innovation fund where around $100 million is pushed into research and innovation. So in terms of Europe, are they directing their money unfairly as well?
Well, it's a line drawing question in one way, because the government certainly has a role to kickstart sectors that it wants to see get a toehold and get a foundation upon which they can then compete. And so, yes, you do tax breaks for certain sectors that you think are in the national interest, and everybody does this, and certainly Europe does this. It certainly makes sense if you want to get an EV industry started, should you be subsidizing charging stations? Because who's going to buy an EV if you can't charge it anywhere? And you need to get those up and running. So some subsidies you expect, and some are okay. The line that's been drawn that the Europeans would argue, and I think everybody else is arguing, is when are you doing this now, not only to get your own domestic industry going, but are you now going to create more jobs in your country and then export all of that excess capacity to another market and then undermine the manufacturing base in that other market? So you're right government subsidize the EV sector. They should subsidize the EV sector. It becomes a line drawing question. And when you talk about $10 billion, $20 billion, which is probably what the Europeans have subsidized EVs for, to $250 billion, that's, you say it's different.
And rare minerals, that's another aspect of this. In terms of China, they're doing all of that very well again. Where do other countries like Europe need to up their game?
Well, this is really one of the critical areas we're watching in the EU-China talks. We're watching it, of course, in the U.S.-China talks, which are going to be back on track in Europe later this month. Is China, because it is so far ahead on rare earths, is China going to use rare earths as, frankly, a weapon to try and get countries like or blocs like the EU to lower their tariffs on Chinese goods? And so rare earths is in the short run something that China has a huge advantage of on. Are they going to use this in terms of trying to get Europe to reduce those tariffs on EVs? And how it will take a long time for Europe and for the United States and other countries to make up where China is on rare earth. So rare earth is completely tied in to these trade negotiations, and it shows that why today, like never before, trade and security are interlinked.
Okay, Stephen Okin, CEO and founder of APAC Advisors, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Tesla has reported a second consecutive quarterly drop in profits. A figure of $1.1 billion is a drop of 16% on the same quarter last year. The company's overall revenues were also down. The transition to a new Model Y car and controversies around Elon Musk's political activities were blamed for a 13% drop in sales. China's BYD is currently the world's top electric vehicle seller. The cost of living is expected to go up in the US, and lowering interest rates could mean that inflation goes even higher. But President Donald Trump and his backers don't agree. He wants lower rates to boost business investment and ease government borrowing costs. The Federal Reserve sets those interest rates, but the chairman of the Fed, Jerome Powell, hasn't lowered rates recently, and that has upset President Trump.
The economy is roaring, business confidence is soaring, incomes are up, prices are down, and inflation is dead. It's dead. We have a bad Fed chairman, really bad. If he would lower the rates, and I tried being nice to the guy, it doesn't help. He's like a knucklehead. No, he's a knucklehead. A stupid guy. He really is.
So let's put this into context then. The Federal Reserve was created in 1913 and has influenced or set US interest rates since. Post-Second World War, interest rates were close to zero, but the rate rose over time until the 1980s, when it hit nearly 20%. Then Chairman Paul Volcker was attempting to bring down an inflation rate of over 14%. He succeeded, but a recession followed with close to 10% unemployment. Since then, the trend has been down. Rates were lowered to near 0% around 2000 when the dot-com bubble burst, the 2008 financial crisis, and during the COVID pandemic. More recently, rates have been between 4 and 5%. But while much of this seems like an internal US issue, it is more than that. Much of the world's economy is tied to what the dollar is doing and changing US interest rates, what it means for the global economy, and specifically poorer nations. Guido Kotzy is a professor of macroeconomics at the University of St. Gallen and a financial analyst, and he joins us from Palermo in Italy. Guido, we are reporting this ahead of a possible meeting between President Trump and the chairman of the Fed. But I wonder if you could explain to us how changes in the US interest rate affect other countries around the world.
Clearly, reducing the interest rates in the United States could stimulate the economy and theoretically relieve some of the poorer countries' debt burden. However, it is important that this decline in the interest rate is stable and done in a stabilizing way. The problem now is that in the United States, inflation is not dead at all. It's still above the 2% target. And the labor market is also pretty tight. So a reduction in the interest rate right now could overstimulate the economy and bring about a burst in prices. Now, if this happens, then the Federal Reserve will be forced to combat this rampant inflation and increase the interest rate too much. As you rightly mentioned, the Volcker period, which let's not forget was paid massively by developing countries which were under dollar-denominated debt. So the problem is if Fed turns down too expansionary too early, this is gonna create the need of a tightening in the future, which will be harmful. So I think the Federal Reserve is pretty wise at the moment. And let's not forget that Jerome Powell, the chairman, is not a hawk. He had been appointed by Donald Trump himself in his first administration in order to run a more accommodating monetary policy. Also, under Jerome Powell in 2020, there was the largest increase in the monetary base in the history of the United States. So they pumped money into the economy already, and the effect actually was a big increase in inflation post-COVID. So we are not talking about Paul Volcker kind of central banker, but actually quite a friendly central banker. Now, if the central bank is waiting for inflation to stabilize closer to target before reducing the interest rate, I think this is wise, and it's not in need of correction.
And of course, Paul Volcker, he did the opposite to what Donald Trump wants to do now. He refused to lower interest rates. How does the US economy then affect poorer nations specifically? If there's a US recession, like there was in the 1980s, what impact does that have on those countries, and what can they do about it?
Well, clearly, when there is a recession in the United States, this is going to drag down demand all over the world. However, let's first notice that the importance of the United States right now in terms of global demand is much lower than in 1980. So in these 45 years, the GDP of the United States relative to the rest of the world has declined massively to less than 1/5. But more than the effect on demand, I think the effect of the interest rates themselves is important, because the dollar still has a disproportionately high role as a currency, and much of poorer countries' debt is denominated in dollars. So it is very vulnerable to what happens to the dollars. So if the interest rate increases a la Volcker, so in response to a big increase in inflation, if monetary policy becomes to tighten in the United States, then to tighten in the United States, this is gonna choke several countries. For example, Pakistan has high dollar denominated debt and very little foreign reserves. Laos, for example, in Asia, or Myanmar, and other countries, also in other continents, in Africa, and even in South America, like Argentina, for example, or Ecuador, are going to suffer. So a rise in the interest rates in the United States will have a disproportionate, strong recessionary effect on relatively low or middle-income countries all over the world.
Guido Kotzy, Professor of Macroeconomics, thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome.
Pakistan has only 5 million taxpayers in a population of 240 million. With a struggling economy, the government is trying to bring in a new tax system, but has faced protests. Loans from the International Monetary Fund, vital to economic recovery, are tied to those changes. Recent protests have been cancelled after a compromise, but Shehbaz Sharif's administration remains caught between voters and IMF demands. Pakistan's dilemma is at least partly due to its informal economy. This term describes economic activities that are not being taxed, regulated or monitored by the government. That means no revenue is collected on it. The size of Pakistan's informal economy is estimated to be around 36% of the country's GDP. That figure comes from the International Labour Organization. They also say huge numbers of workers in rural and urban regions are part of the informal economy. Traders, some modes of transport, domestic help and small-scale agriculture are the kinds of businesses often not registered for tax. And the wide use of cash as payment means transactions are harder to tax because there's no official record. Ali Hassan is an economist and associate professor at Lahore University of Management Sciences, and I'm pleased to say that he joins us from there. Ali, it's absolutely fantastic to have you on the programme. So the IMF is lending Pakistan $7 billion to stabilise Pakistan's economy. But what strings were attached to that loan?
So this is a journey that Pakistan has been through many times. To understand this, you have to understand that we have historically had a very low tax base, as you've introduced the session with, and our expenditures have not been disciplined, but also that we typically have not earned as many dollars in exports as we have spent in imports. And so we continue to be starved of dollars from year to year. And the IMF has come in more than 20 times to stave off potential default risks. Every time it comes, there's a roughly similar package of sort of demands that it makes or conditionalities, which are fairly rational. If you think about them, it's basically saying that you need to balance your books, both in terms of your dollar section of the economy, which is ensuring that you're earning enough dollars to pay off your dollar liabilities, and your books as a government at home. And so that's broadly what's been, what the conditionalities this time have also been.
So, taking that on board, has Pakistan then swayed too far from those IMF conditions? And is Pakistan managing to walk the line between what people and businesses want compared with the IMF stipulations?
Look, ultimately, for Pakistan's economy, the IMF has conditionalities that create constraints, but there's a false dichotomy that gets perpetuated often in the local media between the IMF and the people. The IMF is a lender. It's ultimately our responsibility to ensure that we provide our people with sustainable growth. That means growth that doesn't falter because we have a failure to pay back potential loans or to sustain expenditures at unsustainable levels. And so, first of all, that dichotomy, I think Pakistan has to ultimately own the welfare of its people over the next 10, 15 years to really get away from that. But within the framing of your question, I think the IMF came up with conditionalities that were perhaps strong, but also broadly correct, given the context that we were very near default. Pakistan has stabilized within that framework for the last 2 or 3 years. The problem is that the IMF is not built to help rectify institutional problems and structural problems and so it does not sort of have the responsibility to ensure the country's growth over the next 10, 15 years. That's ultimately Pakistan's own project. And that's something where we are faltering. In terms of, so inflation has been very controlled, but it's growth that isn't getting unstuck. And for that, Pakistan has to go through sort of these political wranglings that are happening day to day these days.
In terms of Pakistan's economic growth, how damaging is the current tax system to Pakistan's economy?
One can answer that at multiple layers. The level of taxation, especially for more compliant sections of the economy, and I'm thinking of, for example, your salaried class and a small section of formal businesses, has been very high. And it's those taxes have been raised year on year by successive governments without really embedding those policy moves within a larger plan or framework of how to progress in a sustainable fashion. So it's been very ad hoc. We're not balancing the books this year, so let's increase the tax rate on salaried class a bit. And that's led to a lot of brain drain from Pakistan, where white collar workers have moved out because it's felt unfair and unsustainable. At the same time, the problem of Pakistan's growth will not happen without ensuring that we're able to finance the government in a sustainable way in the long term. So our tax to GDP ratio is actually very low, is famously very low. It's just that we're taxing some sections of the economy very highly and in very ad hoc and unfair ways, and other parts of the economy are not properly being brought into the tax net.
Yeah, and let's talk about that then, because we were hearing details about the informal economy. So we're talking about street vendors and some modes of transport. You know, huge amounts of people are working in those areas. So how much are those areas of the informal economy to blame for the economic problems in Pakistan?
So this is very debatable, but to my mind, you can bifurcate the informal economy into two sections. One is your small vendors, your small farmers, and other informal activity that is informal because these are people very near the poverty line. They don't have the sophistication or the means to be very compliant with sophisticated tax codes. And there's minimal government spending in support of their industries. There's another informal economy, which is undocumented larger businesses or under-taxed larger businesses and individuals. That's where the problem is, because there are substantial sectors of the economy. Retail is one. Historically, real estate has been another, and arguably agriculture. Especially large-scale agriculture, where there is consensus among economists that they haven't shouldered a proportionate burden of taxation in the past. And so that part of the informal economy is definitely a large part of the problem.
OK, Ali Hassan, thank you very much for taking us through those issues.
You're welcome.
That is our show for this week. Do get in touch with us on X. I'm at Louisa Pilbeam TV. Use the hashtag AJCTC when you do that, or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. There's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC, and that will take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That is it for our edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Louisa Pilbeam from the whole team. Thank you for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is up next.